All right, we are rolling. All right, we're jumping into the heart of the life and ministry of Jesus tonight. A few months we'll be into the Acts of the Apostles, and then we'll wrap up the whole survey in April and May with some church history. The amount of that we can get into is yet to be determined. So tonight we're just going to look at the first year and a half of Jesus' ministry. We have Christmas break, and then we have New Year's break. On the 7th of January is the Christmas party, and all y'all will be here, and I will not. And we're looking for a second adult, probably a parent of the Crumbs, perhaps. We'll
probably
figure that out. So there'll be some communication over Christmas break on all y'all's group text. Kayla, you have a phone too, right? Have you gotten her woven into that group text yet?
Can you add to the group text, or do we have to create a new
We'll
one?
have to create a new one. Yum.
It's really annoying.
It's not
I
like
think we
Messenger
have
where
like-
you can just add as you go.
Apparently
No, it's
not.
not. We have like 4 or 5 of these now.
Yeah.
All right. New group text. Anyway, so Christmas party will be on the 7th, and in about a month, we'll get to the second year of Jesus' ministry on the 14th of January. One thing to keep in mind for your Christmas party is that is the first pineapple competition. And you remember what the pineapple competitions are? So the pineapple competition is a memory verse competition for all the memory verses that have come thus far. And I'll make sure that you go home with a full list of them. If you don't have all those reading sheets, I think I've got copies here. So memorize all of them, and then who can recite them the most effectively, and you'll have to be the judge of that. Mr. Canaday.
No pressure there.
No pressure there, no. So you'll have to look at accuracy, and then if there's tiebreakers, you're going to have to go back to last May or something.
Oh, no. No.
So I will
So
supply the
can anyone
pineapple.
defeat the, like 2 or 3
Reigning
times reigning champ?
That's a lot of pressure to sustain. Like,
I
anyhow.
hope that there's a clear-cut winner. 'Cause I don't want to have to decide, okay, you both are basically amazing, and now I have to choose which one won.
If history's an indicator, there's usually some gap.
Yep.
Yeah.
Verses from last May are well within reason.
Not that I don't want you all to be amazing.
Yes. All right, so we're still looking at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and I think today is the first time that we actually hit all 4 of them with some strength, because the first year of Jesus' ministry is covered in depth in all of them. Long time we'll get to some of the other books of the New Testament. All right, there was a question last week that I thought I would address before we jump into this. Because Jesus was born in 5 BC, but that's 5 years before Christ, which sounds ridiculous. So, let's look at the creation of the BC AD system, so we understand the dating here. Greek name, he was actually in the Eastern Roman Empire in the days just before Justinian. Guy by the name of Dionysius Exiguus. He's a Scythian monk from Romania, which is on the coast of the Black Sea, north of Constantinople. He moves to Rome in AD 500, which is after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, but Rome is back under control of the Eastern Empire for a short while. And while he's there, he comes up with a new idea. At the time, they're using Diocletian's dating system, and he was an emperor at 284 to 305, and he widely persecuted Christians. When you think of all the martyrs in the early church, a lot of them and most of the stories come from his reign. And so every single year was counted from Diocletian's accession, so year 525 AD was the 242nd year of Diocletian. And the Christians decided, we've had enough of dating from Diocletian because we don't actually like the guy. And the empire has changed its disposition towards the church entirely. So in 525, Dionysius comes up with this new way, and he's like, why go from a secular emperor's reign? Why not just get something that is greater than that, and so he figures the birth of Jesus. There's a little bit of argument and disagreement as to whether it was when Jesus' birth was announced, which would be a March date, or whether his birthday, or whether it would be when he was actually born. It is shifted towards when he was born. But anyway, comes up with what we now know as the BC AD system, BC being before Christ, AD being Anno Domini, which is Latin for in the year of our Lord. What?
Okay, so I just realized this right now, but was English around for them to say before Christ?
Nope.
Or is that, like, or does BC?
I'm not sure what the Latin was at the time.
But it was.
It got translated into English eventually, so that the English version of the system is BC and AD. So every country in Western Europe has slightly different letters and such that they use for it.
Oh,
Okay.
oh dear.
But why do we use the AD Latin letters and not BC English letters?
I don't know.
Well,
Because they couldn't say ITY or L.
Right.
Probably they were anticipating AC electrical current, and they're like, we can't cause that confusion. Before Christ and after Christ. So, no, it has nothing to do with that. Yeah, let's see. So one interesting feature is there is no year 0. Every number line, we have a 0 on the number line. AD BC has no year 0. So you go from 1 BC to 1 AD. And actually, technically speaking, I found out I've been doing this all wrong my entire life. You have 1 BC, but you have AD 1. But I didn't even follow that on this.
It's AD
So,
1.
Yep. So Jesus was born in 5 BC, and then 4 years later, it shifted to AD 1.
So we're in
What the
AD
heck?
2023.
Yes, and now we're in AD 2023.
so it's 5 before Christ, or in the year of our Lord 1.
Right.
I mean, that kind of makes sense.
Yes. Now, Dionysius did not preserve his calculations, and so nobody knows how he made a mistake or where he made a mistake, but we know he made a mistake because Herod the Great was not alive when we hit 1 BC and 1 AD. And so Jesus could not have been born at that year based on chronologies developed since then. And so you have Jesus being born at the very end of 5 BC instead of at the very end of 1 BC.
Or conspiracy theory was correct, and you've screwed up since things had since then.
Sure, there you go. Anyway, this system was actually used very infrequently for 250 years, and it wasn't until Charlemagne became emperor of the Holy Roman Empire and a Irish monk or British monk came and was a scholar in his court and made this popular. And so this is the late 8th century, which would be like 775 to 800 AD, that this is actually starting to become popular. And because Charlemagne's empire covered a fair chunk of Western Europe, it spread across almost all of Western Europe. But it was still almost 1500 before it was even adopted in Spain.
Isn't Charlemagne? Is that French?
Charlemagne is French.
Oh,
Yes.
oh,
Charles the Magnificent.
right.
So that is how we ended up with our current dating system. Even the Chinese have adopted it, but they shift it. They don't use AC, AD or BC. They just simply say it's the year 2023 in the Common Era, or the
Yeah.
Western Era.
Yeah,
They have their own year
they've
system,
secularized that.
but
Well, and now in school they call it BCE.
yeah,
before Common
Common Era and Common
yep,
Era.
that's the more inclusive, so you don't have to assume somebody has religious faith in order to date the world. You can just simply have the Common Era and before the Common Era.
I will point out though,
But they mean the same thing.
Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's an atheist, he still uses BC and AD because he's like, if the Christians created this amazing like numbering system that like is actually worked, like might as well give him credit.
It's true. It did work, and it was created by a Christian. All right, so we're gonna do a quick overview of Jesus' ministry, because it is the Passovers of his ministry by which we can figure out how long he even ministered for. And so we're going to look at the first one here in 30 AD. This is recorded in John chapter 2. And this is one of those events of Jesus' ministry where it looks like he does something that's recorded early in John and later in the other Gospels, but this is actually a similar event happening twice, where he flips over all the money changers' tables. And so the first time it happens is at Passover in 30 AD. Jesus goes up to Jerusalem, and the Jews say to him, after they ask him for a sign for his authority, he says, "Destroy this temple and I'll raise it up again in 3 days." And they think that he's referring to the temple that they're standing in instead of the temple of his body. And they're like, "It's taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up again in 3 days?" And so from that, we know when that temple construction began, and that was under Herod the Great. And so counting 46 years forward from that, we land in 30 AD. So this is right at the very beginning of Jesus' ministry, which we'll see a little later this evening. And we can nail that year to 30 AD with a lot of confidence based on this one verse in John 2:20. This is the first time he clears out the money changers. He does it a second time, we'll find. Second Passover is going to be 1 year later. And so we're going to calculate this to be 31 AD. And this Passover is mentioned in John 5:1. It says, "After this there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem." And this is when he heals a paralytic guy at the pool of Bethesda. Now it is a little bit of an assumption, but it is a reasonable assumption that this feast that is being referenced is Passover, based on a few other feasts and holidays that are mentioned in the previous chapter. So this is presumed to be the second Passover of Jesus' ministry. So the third Passover is referenced in John 6:4, the very next chapter. It says, "Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand," and that is placing the feeding of the 5,000 just slightly before this third Passover in 32 AD. So then we get to the fourth Passover, which is perhaps the more famous of them. This is in John as well, which is nice here because we have all 4 Passovers referenced in the same gospel. So we can lay out Jesus' ministry just simply from a single gospel. In John 13:1, it says, "Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end." And this is right before the Last Supper. And this one is 33 AD. And one of the nice things is that you can calculate what day of the week Passovers were in past years based on the lunar calendar that the Jews were using. And guess what day of the week that Passover was on? Friday.
Oh, that's right.
Guess what was significant about that Friday? Is Good Friday, precisely. That's the day that Jesus got crucified. But if you remember from last year, when do the Jews start their day?
At 6 in the morning,
Nope.
So,
Sundown. Very good.
they start their,
The day starts at sundown, so they start celebrating Passover in the evening at the Last Supper, and Passover has not yet finished until the end of the day when Jesus gets buried, just before sundown,
oh wow.
right before the Sabbath.
So he's in the ground for that day.
Part of that day, the whole next day, and part of the third day, which in a Jewish counting reckons for 3 days.
So he gets raised on Monday?
Sunday. Gets buried on Sunday.
Wait, so it's
No, he gets buried on Friday.
So Thursday night, Friday.
Yep, it goes Thursday night into Friday.
Into
He's
Friday.
crucified and dies on Friday.
Dies on Friday. Okay.
He's in the ground all day on Saturday,
Yeah.
rises on Sunday morning,
Yeah.
which is how we have the third day that he's raised. It's not the standard English reckoning
It's not
by
like
the
36
hour.
hours or
It's not
something.
70.
It's about 36 hours, yep. That causes all kinds of consternation. I have heard debates and arguments and discussions endlessly in some places. But whether Jesus was crucified on Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday. And anyhow, we'll get to the deeper version of that discussion in a month or two. Jesus' ministry begins, though. There's a little bit of overlap with John the Baptist's ministry, so we're going to see a few things here that overlap. Like when he meets John and Andrew. So this is actually really the first year and a half of Jesus' ministry, because we have not quite gotten to that first Passover. There's just a couple of things that take place before then. Now, if you got your maps out, that black and white one that says Jesus' first year of ministry, you can use that if you want. You can start drawing lines, connecting dots about where Jesus is going during his first year of ministry. So he starts off at Bethany across the Jordan, which is going to be on the Jordan River, up towards the northern end of it, south of the Sea of Galilee at some point. I don't believe Bethany is labeled.
Oh dear.
Yeah, Bethany's on there.
Bethany is on there?
Where?
Where?
Very bottom of the map.
Oh,
Ah, wait, there's two.
There are two.
Let me see that map.
Edit,
Don't
there are
argue
two
with me.
Bethany's.
They're right next to each other too.
Well, kind of. One's right by Jerusalem, and the other one's to the right.
Yep, there were two Bethanys.
Bethany across the Jordan, so that's the one.
That'd be the one by the Jordan.
Okay.
Okay, so that's where John was baptizing. And that's where he picks up his first disciples, I believe.
So like,
So that's the starting point. Now, since we already pointed out that there's at least two Bethanys, it is entirely possible that you will find another map with another Bethany, and it is not outside the question. I would have guessed that he was on the northern stretch of the Jordan River, just a little south of the Sea of Galilee, but I don't have it labeled on there, and the Bethany I do have right next to the Jordan is way down south. We'll work with it. We know he's on the Jordan River, near a village named Bethany.
Yeah.
So he gets John and Andrew there. Andrew goes and fetches Peter. And then the four of them leave for Galilee. On the way, they find Philip. And then Philip goes and fetches Nathanael. So,
hold on a second.
Wait. What do you mean? Okay. So James has yet to come along.
yep, James has not come along yet. We have Andrew and John and Peter. And then they pick up Nathanael and Philip along the way.
Oh, that's
Those guys are all Galileans. I think they're mostly from Bethesda neighborhood. So these are the first 5 disciples that Jesus starts interacting with. It only took 2 days. On the 3rd day, they arrive in Cana of Galilee, which is why I think that they're further north on the Jordan River, because they were really booking it. But I guess they could have. Yes, Cana in Galilee. Find that way up in the north. And this is where Jesus' first miracle takes place. His mother's there, and he turns water into wine. And this is not a small quantity of water. It's not just a few cups. It's somewhere between 120 and 180 gallons.
Yeah, that's impressive.
That is a lot of wine.
And it
They
was
did that
wine.
good in the
In the Chosen, yes.
It was,
It was
a
good
lot.
wine though, which means it was aged wine.
Yes. It's a wine that was only a couple minutes old and tasted very aged.
Yeah.
That's
Evidently.
Yep.
Dude, imagine if they actually did age that then.
Mhm.
Like,
So this contributes to the belief of his disciples, because they saw what happened, even though not everybody else knew what happened. After that, they leave and they go to Capernaum. There for an unspecified number of days. And then they head down to Jerusalem. And this is where we hit the first Passover.
wait, could you go back to the slide?
Yeah, you don't have to write everything down,
Okay.
but yeah, you have access to these on the computer in your bedroom, like you really wouldn't have to.
I don't have time outside of this. to take
True.
notes. Right.
All right. So then he goes down to Jerusalem with his disciples. At this point, we don't have all 12 collected. We only know of 5 that he's got. He may have a few more. He may have a few less. He might have some that did not become the 12 apostles. Jesus' disciple collecting was not as structured as we like to think of it. While he's down there, he's in the temple courts, finds people selling cattle, sheep, doves, and they're exchanging money at the tables. Jesus makes a whip and drives them out. So remember, if you ever get one of those WWJD bracelets, which asks the question, what would Jesus do? Flipping tables over is within the realm of options.
And makes me
And
know
using whips.
And using whips.
That is. Yeah.
Yes.
So when next time Royal Big Nell says, "What would Jesus do?"
Flipping tables.
Flip tables and use
Yep.
a whip.
Now, while he's in Jerusalem, he meets with Nicodemus. And this is the famous chapter in John chapter 3. This is very different than the Chosen rendition. The Chosen moves Nicodemus up to Galilee, and I don't know why, because in John, Jesus is very clearly down in Jerusalem. And Nicodemus is one of the ruling council members, member of the Sanhedrin. He meets with Jesus secretly during the night. You don't want to be seen in public, but sometimes it's easier to have a good conversation when everybody else is in bed. So, the reason we know that this takes place in Jerusalem is because Jesus had just gone down there for the Passover feast, and right after he's done with Nicodemus, it says that they go into the Judean countryside. So we don't have Jesus having moved elsewhere in the meantime. Presumably this all happens in Jerusalem. So then this is at the end of John chapter 3. Jesus and his disciples go off into the Judean countryside, and they're baptizing at the Jordan. At this time, John the Baptist is baptizing at Aenon near Salem. We don't know precisely where Jesus is, just along the Jordan in the wilderness, perhaps near Bethany. But then the Pharisees in Jerusalem learn that Jesus is getting really big crowds, and so Jesus and his disciples leave Judea and head back to Galilee. They don't go the standard route along the Jordan River, though. They cut through Samaria and go to Sychar. As far as I can tell, Sychar is a relatively small village in Samaria. There's a well there that Jacob had dug 2,000 years almost earlier. And this is where Jesus has a conversation with the woman at the well. And it was a very scandalous conversation because men did not talk with women in the middle of the day who were not accompanied by some other male figure from their family. And Jews did not associate and talk with Samaritans. And you definitely don't ask somebody to do something for you, and Jesus just does all three. So, he gives a word of knowledge and commends her for telling the truth. Says, "You're right. You have no husband. You've had 5, and the one you're with right now isn't your own." It's one of those mic drop moments. The woman realizes he's a prophet, goes back into village, tells the village, "I met a man who told me everything I ever did," and I got their attention because they knew her, they knew everything she did. They stay there for 2 days. A lot of people believe in Samaria there. And then he continues on into Galilee and goes back to Cana. We're still in John chapter 4. So in Cana, he meets an official who had walked there from Capernaum.
That's a decent way.
That was a decent ways, yes. And that's why the guy was walking back to Capernaum the next day when he met servants who were walking to him in Cana, and they have a conversation on the road between Cana and Capernaum about how his son had gotten healed and recovered the day before, right at the hour that Jesus said, "Your son will live."
That makes so much more sense.
Yep, looking at the map.
Looking at the map, you can understand the sense of that. Because the guy turned around and started walking back to Capernaum right after talking to Jesus. It didn't make it all the way back and was still on the way the next day. So he wasn't moving crazy fast. Don't think so. Didn't commonly happen. So there's a little bit of an implication that Jesus' disciples depart or leave him at this point in time, not on bad terms, just they don't show up in the next scene that we find him. John has a big gap in the record, and the next time we find Jesus doing something is in Luke chapter 4. He goes to Nazareth, his childhood town. And this is best guess at how we can put the sequence of the Gospels together. You may find other people that do the sequence differently. If you find an Harmony of the Gospels version where they have all 4 Gospel accounts in 4 different columns across a page, you might find that they put the sequence together differently. This is just simply the best rendition of it that I have been able to develop and come across. But I won't claim that there aren't other ways that this could fit together. So anyway, Jesus goes to Nazareth, which is his childhood town. He speaks there in the synagogue on the Sabbath. His disciples don't appear to be with him at this point in time, and he intercepts them a little bit later in the Luke, Mark, and Matthew accounts. So as far as we can tell, he is alone at this point in time, but we know from John he's already been interacting with them. So he reads Isaiah 61, 1 and 2, which we've already read twice now today. Remember this verse from the sword drill? Yes. What does he say?
That's a coincidence.
That was pretty awesome. I don't even remember. What does it say again? I've seen too many verses today.
It's like,
I am the one.
It's like the guy who it's like I am you bring in.
All right, Micaiah, look up Isaiah 61, 1 through 2. You got it right
Oh, I
there.
have 61, I don't have 61,
1 and 2 is what we'll get.
Right, so pages will turn. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, and to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to those who are bound, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn.
All right. So Jesus reads this and then claims that it is fulfilled in their hearing, which causes lots and lots of conversation because that's a really bold claim. And they drive him out of Nazareth. They intend to throw him over a cliffside. I have not found where that cliffside is in the neighborhood of Nazareth, but apparently there was a cliff that was available. And somehow we don't know if this was supernatural or if it was just socially everybody was like, I'm not sure if I want to be the one that throws him and pushes him, but Jesus just walks through the crowd and gets away. It is not his time to die. Somewhere right around this time, John the Baptist gets thrown into prison. We know he was baptizing and out of prison earlier, which is one of the reasons we know that all those events recorded in John happened before what we start finding in Mark chapter 1, because Mark says that once John the Baptist was thrown in prison, Jesus arrives at the Sea of Galilee. So we presume he goes from Nazareth to Galilee. And when he gets there, he calls Peter and Andrew. And this is a good illustration of how the 3 gospel accounts have a very different version of it. Because in Mark and Matthew, it's just he's walking along the lake and he says, come follow me. And they leave their nets and they go follow Jesus. And then they come across John and James and says, come follow me. And they leave their nets and follow him. And that's how Matthew and Mark present it. Luke has the extended length version of it. And Jesus actually is preaching a sermon in Peter's boat. And then says to Peter, push out into deeper water. And they let out the nets and they get this massive catch of fish. And they pull it in, and James and John are actually his fishing partners and are helping him pull in all the fish. And then Peter's like, go away from me. I am not worthy. I'm a sinful man. And Jesus says, follow me. But in any case, one of the things that I find is really interesting is that all these guys have already met him, know him, and have interacted with him, with the exception of possibly James.
See miracles.
They've seen miracles from him. So him walking by on the lakeside and saying, come follow me, is not quite the way. There's a little bit more backstory, I should say. It's not like running across somebody on Main Street and saying, hey, come follow me, and they're just like, oh, I've We must go follow this strange person I don't know. Because that was the way it was always presented to me in my younger years, and I just never knew that there was a lot more to their relationship already established at this point in time.
It does actually make sense. I always thought it was like a supernatural thing. I mean, it obviously is a supernatural thing still, but
Mm-hmm.
the supernatural that Jesus spoke, and they said, yeah, that's what
Yeah, let's leave our boats.
Yep. Now, at this point, they had already had a 6-month relationship, and John and Andrew had been hanging out with John the Baptist, Crazy John,
Oh, yeah,
Crazy
trees.
John.
and so they clearly are seeking after God and trying to figure out what's the way we're supposed to go. God's doing something in the wilderness. We'll hang out with this guy. He's got a message that we have not heard before. And then they find Jesus, and they're following him around, and they see him turn water into wine, and this guy gets healed at a distance from Cana to Capernaum. That was one of the other things I think was amazing about that miracle, is that the healing takes place at a 30-mile radius range or something like that. It was a good distance. Anyhow, and then there's the miraculous catch of fish, and so Jesus says, "Follow me." They're like, "We're going to follow this guy." Anyway, so that's another one of his miracles. And Zebedee was hanging out there with John and James, and they leave their father and follow Jesus.
Oh, yeah, Zebedee was
From the shore of the Sea of Galilee, they go into Capernaum. And they go to the synagogue on the Sabbath day there, which is not the day they arrived there. Jesus starts teaching in the synagogue, which causes everybody to be amazed. And somebody manifests a demon there, an evil spirit gets driven out, and then they're even more amazed because not only is he teaching with authority, but he commands demons to leave people, and they do. They leave the synagogue. Same day, they go to Peter and Andrew's house. Peter's mother-in-law is there. She's sick with fever. She gets healed by Jesus, gets up and starts serving them, and after sunset that night, all kinds of people are coming to the house, and Jesus heals them of various diseases and drives out many demons, it says. And all this happens in a single day.
So Peter was married.
This Peter was married.
Never realized that, I feel.
It is implied very clearly in Mark. Peter's mother-in-law was sick. If he has a mother-in-law, he has a wife. Next morning, everybody wakes up and can't find Jesus because he left and is praying in a solitary place. Yeah, Jesus was not an extrovert fully. He was not an introvert fully. He was somewhere in the middle. He had recharge time in the morning in solitary places. His companions come looking for him, try to bring him back into Capernaum, and he says, "Nope, we're going to go to the villages of Galilee." And then there's some summary verses there where it says he's preaching in synagogues and driving out demons. Now, it is probable that it's in this ministry trip around Galilee to the various different villages that the Sermon on the Mount takes place. The precise timing of the Sermon on the Mount is a little hard to nail down, but the consensus is it is probably in the very early part of Jesus' ministry, based on how Matthew and Mark arrange things. Sermon on the Mount is one of the most unique things in the whole New Testament. There's nothing quite like it in Mark or John. In Luke, there's a few long sermons, one of which is known as the Sermon on the Plain, and that one has some parallels to the Sermon on the Mount, but it is not the same sermon. There's differences, and it's in a different geographical location. This is unlike anything you find in the book of Acts. Now, one of the things that I find fascinating about this is that he's got one overarching theme that runs through the whole sermon, and it's encapsulated in these two verses here. It says, "I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." Now, Pharisees were known as who? What was their reputation?
The goody two shoes of the nation.
The goody two shoes of society. That's a really good way to put it. And then if that's not stiff enough, he says, "You therefore must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect."
That's difficult.
That is difficult.
Lot to live up to.
That's a lot to live up to, right? Can anybody live up to that?
I think the only way I can live up to that is if I just slept the entire day, because then there's no
But you
chance
feel
of-
sloth.
Yeah.
Yeah, oh, yeah.
So,
Pop that bubble.
That's only a day. Then I'll wake up and I'm automatically doing stuff wrong.
Mm-hmm. So that's one of the fascinating things about the Sermon on the Mount, is that Jesus begins his ministry by essentially saying, the Pharisees are trying to tell you this is what you have to do to be righteous, and what they're even saying is not even nearly far righteous enough. You have to exceed what the Pharisees say, and he gives them a whole bunch of examples and then lays out all these things, and essentially you have to be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect in heaven. Can anyone attain to that?
No.
And he leaves them hanging like that for 3 years.
Are you serious?
He dies.
Right, because no one can actually be perfect. We all need a Savior. We all need the righteousness of Christ. And it's just one of those really long unanswered mysteries of his ministry, is that he lays it out, and your righteousness and perfection has to exceed the Pharisees. You have to be perfect like my Father is in heaven, because no one can enter the presence of the Father unless they're perfect, right? And that is one of those big conundrums of mankind, is we can't actually ever do that in and of ourselves. Now, one of the things that I always cringe at is when preachers are talking about how people need to live up to the Sermon on the Mount, when I really think that Jesus was laying this out and saying, just try and figure out how you could possibly pull this off, because you can't, and you don't even realize how much you need me and my righteousness just yet.
Wait, so you're doing the advisor's trick where he's saying this is the super difficult way, and he's gonna get his way, which is right? See where I'm going?
Yeah, I get what you're saying, okay.
Sure.
Rings.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Something like that, yep. Anyway, Sermon on the Mount gets a lot of attention, though. There was somebody who was on the fringe of that, because coming down the mountainside, he meets a leper. And this is recorded both in Matthew 8 and Mark 1, which is why we throw the Sermon on the Mount right there. Lepers are not allowed to be in the presence of people, so they wouldn't have been in the crowd to listen, but apparently this leper knew about Jesus. So Jesus is filled with compassion, heals the leper, warns the guy not to say anything about being healed, but the man doesn't listen, talks freely, and this has huge implications for Jesus' ministry, because he can't enter a town without developing a huge crowd in any village. And so in Mark it specifically says that he stays out in lonely places, and in spite of that, crowds still came to him from everywhere.
Hey, that just always, every time I read or hear about this, it just sounds exhausting.
Yes.
It seems like he should have been scared of the healing reversing when he disobeys the command.
Skin starts to turn white. Wait, no, that wasn't true. What?
Right.
the Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away.
Yep. Didn't reverse. Some people just have to talk. I'm related to some like that.
Oh my gosh.
So,
I resemble somebody like that.
a few days later, he does enter Capernaum, and it's interesting that Mark has a verse, or a snippet of a verse, that says it was reported that he was at home. What does that imply?
He lives there.
He now lives in Capernaum. Capernaum becomes his hometown, and he has a house there. It is sometimes just referred to as the house. In Capernaum, large crowd ends up gathering. 4 men arrive on the outskirts of the crowd carrying a paralytic. They can't get to Jesus, so they just bust a hole in the roof, lower the paralytic down to Jesus.
Is this Jesus' house?
Might be Jesus' house.
I just rip open someone's roof and just start lowering someone through. Man, if I was like, the woman in the household or whatever, I would be looking up in terror because number one, someone's going through my roof, because number two, like, you have to fix the thing.
Yeah, I don't think it was quite as much disassembly and destruction as we would have to envision going through one of our roofs. Think of like taking apart Legos, disassembling a roof, and then
There
you
are
just reassemble
some
it.
things that are very difficult to
Yep.
put back together.
So somehow this was socially acceptable enough for them to get away with it. Even if it was Jesus' house, which it might have been, can't remember.
If a guy got healed, I feel like there was some grace, and everyone just
Mm-hmm. Now, if you want to really stir up a firestorm, though, you do something that nobody expects you to do first, and Jesus does that. So this guy gets lowered down in front of him, and Jesus says, "Your sins are forgiven," which just like totally turns everybody's head, because no one in the history of the world has ever forgiven sins up to this point.
Wait, are you serious?
Yes, who has the power to forgive sins?
No, Jesus.
Only God.
They don't know that.
Right. Only God can forgive sin. That's one of the ironies, is they're like, you can't do that. Only God can forgive sins. And so this is one of those little hints that Jesus is just throwing out there, just like, see what you make of this in a few years. And then, to reinforce the point that he has the power to forgive sins, he also tells the guy, stand up and walk. And this is just too much for too many people.
Well, yeah, because wasn't the theory that like the paralyzed and the lepers and all them people were being punished for their sins? So Jesus was like, your sins are forgiven. You know, your punishment is being like.
Yeah, that was one of the theories, is that if you were suffering from something, it was punishment for some evil that you or your parents committed. And so that one may have been something Jesus was addressing, but he tells the guy his sins are forgiven, and Jesus is just treating this like, hey, it's easy to say words like your sins are forgiven because you can't tangibly see anything has changed. Who even cares about that? That's easy to say. But to say that you stand up and walk, well, then everybody's got expectation. The guy's got to actually stand up and walk, or your words mean nothing. But then the guy does stand up and walk, and that means his words really do mean something. So,
I never realized the importance of that.
yeah. Short-circuited quite a few minds that day.
Including some Pharisees.
Yep. So then he goes walking beside the Sea of Galilee again, finds Matthew at his tax collector's booth, calls Matthew, and this is more of a random thing, although I imagine that Jesus was well known and Matthew had probably heard of this guy by this time at least. But this is the first time that Jesus intercepts Matthew. Matthew leaves his tax collector's booth and follows him. That night they have dinner at Matthew's house with a whole bunch of other tax collectors and sinners. The Pharisees can't understand why he would do this, because if you don't like what people do, what do? You disassociate with them, right? And Jesus turns that on his head, and all the people who do things that shouldn't be done, or you don't like what they do, he actually chooses to associate with them. And he tells them only the sick people need a doctor to justify his actions. So best I can tell, that is the last event of his first year of ministry. Now, mind you, we've only actually seen about 12 or 13 out of 365 days. So there's quite a bit of time that happened, and quite a few days worth of events, ministry, teachings that we don't actually have well recorded.
Dude, the unscripted.
Unscripted stuff.
Do you think
So-
any of it was like repetitive, like his speeches?
I suspect a lot of his sermons were repetitive, and that's why, some people think that the Sermon on the Mount comes across in Luke, although it's called the Sermon on the Plain. They're like, wow, but this sounds really similar to the Sermon on the Mount. I'm like, dude, you've never traveled with a preacher who preaches in 5 different churches. They say the same message at every single place, and if you're going around with him, you just remember the one message. Say he said it at one place, and he said it everywhere else too. So it's entirely possible that almost all of Jesus' teachings are actually recorded in the New Testament. At least large lion's share
He
of them.
probably had some spice that he
Mhm.
added to different ones, certain regions.
There are some parables that clearly come across in 2 versions. We'll illustrate
Precisely.
those. I don't think we have actually had a single parable delivered yet, though. We'll do a few things in summary here. Discipleship of his disciples in the first year. He has called a few of them to follow him. Most of their following him ends up just simply listening to him and seeing him teach and watching him perform signs and wonders. It has been a very low intensity discipleship. They're walking around with him, seeing what he does, and listening to what he says. And we're going to look at how this develops over the next few weeks, going into a second and third year, because Jesus' purpose on earth was to create a group that would be able to self-replicate on an unending fashion to the ends of the earth over hundreds of generations, 2,000 years and going, and he had to pull it off in 3.5 years without any of our modern technology.
No wonder he walked everywhere.
Now, first year, major signs that are recorded. You've already written most of these down. This is just the summary list here. But he turns water into wine. He has the word of knowledge for the woman at the well. Heals the official's son at a distance, not bound by time or space. There's the miraculous catch of fish. That one's only recorded in Luke. Doesn't come across in Matthew and Mark, I don't believe. Drives out demons, and he does quite a few of those. One is specifically detailed out. Heals his mother-in-law's fever. There's a few summary verses that talk about him healing various diseases. But then specifically, he heals a leper and a paralytic, and those are two really serious issues that people were facing. It's kind of like the cancer of their day, or heart disease. And those were terminal, chronic, unending, and huge impact on life. Any questions from Jesus' first year of ministry?
Cure for cancer eventually then, if given enough time.
Say what?
We'll probably come up with a cure to cancer eventually if given enough time.
But there are several cures for various different cancers. It's just that there's way more cancers than one or two.
Right.
Well, in theory, it's not that difficult of a cure. It's just how to cure it without killing every other cell.
Yup. How to cure the cancer without killing the patient. That has been a challenge too. All right. We will end with that. And in a month, we'll get back to Jesus' second year of ministry.